Hello and welcome to today's special webinar event on executive disorders, cognitive and systemic risk in the boardroom. Today's webinar is sponsored by SecurityScorecard and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, there are a few things you should know about this webinar. First off, we want this to be a very educational event for you, so we encourage any and all questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering a few resources. Those include a link to the Gorilla Guide book club, where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's great printed resources on technology topics. We also have a link to the ATM Event Center, where you can find more fantastic events like this one. Third, at the end of this webinar event, we'll be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky attendee on the live event. So if you're watching this webinar on demand, I'm sorry, but the drawing has already occurred. And if you are the winner, you can choose to keep the card for yourself, handy in this holiday season, or you can also choose to donate the value of that gift card to one of our selected charities. Thanks to generous prize winners on previous Actual Tech Media events, thousands of dollars have been donated to charity, so thank you in advance if you make that choice today. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in your handout section at the bottom there of the handout section. And finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenter. So to help encourage your question, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. At the end of the event, we'll look at all of the questions, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you our presenter today, Mike Wilkes. He's Chief Information Security Officer at SecurityScorecard. So now I'm going to turn things over to Mike.
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to my presentation on executive disorders, cognitive and systemic risk in the boardroom. My name is Mike Wilkes, and I am the CISO at SecurityScorecard. And you may notice that this headshot is a little bit out of date. I've got a little bit of gray hair since this was taken, but I'm also not this guy either, which was a Oldify filter on the Face app. So I'm somewhere in between. And let's see, a little bit about myself. So I have been doing this a long time. I've been building infrastructure on the internet since back before the World Wide Web was a protocol, actually. I wrote a book for Cisco Press back in 2002. I gave Starbucks its first website back in 1998. I launched PlayStation.com for the Sony PS2 back in 2000, and also put KLM behind Akamai when I lived and worked in Europe. I also launched Blockbuster.com during the whole .com rise and fall, kind of the roaring 20s of my generation. After living and working in Europe for many years, building Rabobank direct banks, Nuon, Vattenfall energy management systems, I moved back to the US in 2013 and began running the Chicago Mercantile Exchange enterprise server group with $1 quadrillion in contracts traded back in 2014. But usually people are most interested in my work at Marvel, where I was the head of DevOps, InfoSec, and enterprise architecture. And I like to joke that it was my job to keep Iron Man safe. And lots of great stories to tell about my time there, working with Disney security officers from ABC, ESPN, Disney Plus, Lucasfilm, Pixar. After that, I was the CISO at ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, a small $1.2 billion revenue organization that gives money, collects royalties for the writers of the songs that stitch together the fabric of our society. So a really great member-based and values-driven organization there. I'm an ASCAP member myself. I play drums. I'm a jazz musician, and I was very happy to build and protect that infrastructure. For example, Paul Williams Williams is the chairman of the board for ASCAP, and he wrote the song "The Rainbow Connection" for the Muppet movie. So you can't imagine a more soft and fuzzy, clientele and membership to protect. About 800,000 members of ASCAP. But that takes me up to my current position at SecurityScorecard, where we're making the world a safer place, and we're scanning the internet every day and giving security ratings. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But little enough about me. Let's talk about the agenda for today. I'd like to go through the definitions and dimensions of risk, and also discuss a couple of kinds of risk that I think aren't getting a lot of attention lately, cognitive risk and systemic risk. Then I'll continue talking about how we solve some of these problems, my section on This is the Way, a reference to The Mandalorian, and then conclude with a quick summary. So definitions and dimensions of risk. So this is your typical risk matrix. People look at things as being on a 1 to 5 scale, and they look at the risk as equal to probability of an event happening times the impact. And for most cases, 5 is bad. Although technically, if you think of DEFCON, defense condition readiness, this is the reverse, where DEFCON 1 is maximum alertness and DEFCON 5 is normal or peacetime readiness. But basically, people look and analyze their risk across these 2 dimensions. But before we go too far into that, I wanted to talk about a couple other dimensions and measures of risk. And before I can do that, I wanted to throw out a definition of cyberspace, a concept describing a widespread interconnected digital technology. And so the term cyberspace first appeared in fiction in the 1980s in the work of cyberpunk author William Gibson, in his 1982 short story Burning Chrome, and then later in his 1984 novel Neuromancer. In the next few years after that, the word became prominently identified with online computer networks. And I have a quote here. Gibson commented on the origin of the term in the 2000 documentary No Maps for These Territories. And I quote, "All I knew about the word cyberspace when I coined it was that it seemed like an effective buzzword. It seemed evocative and essentially meaningless. It was suggestive of something, but had no real semantic meaning, even for me, as I saw it emerge upon the page." And so I like to break down this concept of cyberspace into 3 different dimensions myself, instead of the typical, physical and virtual or hardware and software. I actually roll that up into just the physical dimension. So in the case of the physical, you have hardware and software. Why? Because software needs somewhere to run. Even virtual servers run on something physical at some point. And I'm going to break these down for a minute and just sort of explode them to make sure we have common definitions in use here. An interesting way of describing, though, cyberspace is to ask the question, where are you when you're on the phone? Shown here is a frame from a hyperbolic space tiled with dodecahedra from a 1990 film entitled Not Not, which was from the University of Minnesota, talking about mathematics and knot theory. And so I often think of cyberspace as kind of being like hyperspace and hyperbolic space where you're flying around. And if you find the video for this, it's in my slides. It's quite the interesting video that talks about math and Lobachevskian and hyperbolic space. But the next piece here, physical. This is basically the core technical infrastructure of all of our networked hardware and software. And this comprises, things across land, sea, air, and space, and various exploits to the electromagnetic spectrum to enable the flow of information between producers, consumers, audiences, and systems. And cyberspace, of course, has a informational component. And this is content or data at rest or in transit. And in this case, this is generally referred to as information, of course. But in this case, we're talking about machine readable content, numbers, text, audio, pictures, video, all of this. And this is where your cyber persona actually resides. Digital representations of individuals or other entities that use cyberspace and have one or more identities that can be identified, attributed, and acted upon. I know I have, as a security officer, I have a couple of personas that I use for different subscriptions and access to different platforms. And then lastly, this third piece of cyberspace's dimension is the cognitive. And this is the one that I think is not, like I said, paid attention to enough, and I want to spend a little time talking with you about today. Cognitive dimension is our knowledge, our values, our beliefs, concepts, intentions, and perceptions of individuals and groups. And so these are the actors, these actors are the creators and the users of the content that moves through the physical layer. And this dimension, it provides the societal, cultural, religious, and historical contexts that influence the perceptions of those producing the content and those consuming it. So in this case, governments, criminals, activists, hackers, we all think, perceive, visualize, understand, and decide within this dimension. All right, so now that I've gone through some of the dimensions, I wanted to talk about first party, second party, third party, and nth party. We often talk about third-party risk, but we don't often define what's first party or second party. So I wanted to go 4 dimensions here for each of these. So in first party, you have self-attestation. You know what your infrastructure is, presumably because you have direct control over it. You have complete internal awareness, and trust is manifested through control because it's your infrastructure. And the domain of management is enterprise risk management. So in this case, this is your typical, first person, data center that you operate yourself, for example, or lease out to a third party. In this case, second party risk is your customers, people that are consuming your products, potentially on the internet or in real life. And in this case, customer attestation is holding sway. And the customers have firsthand, but only partial awareness of your platform and of your infrastructure. They're putting things into a shopping cart. They're there looking at error messages potentially when things don't go well on a transaction, for example. Trust is exhibited through familiarity and brand loyalty, and contractual risk management is how we manage risk. There's terms and conditions, of course, on our sale of products and the return of them and things like that. Now, third party, this has been pretty much the sweet spot of people understanding risk for the last year and a half, with some of the compromises that took place, like SolarWinds and the backdoor attack of Kaseya and Colonial Pipeline being hacked. People realize now that the third-party risk is significant because it can have really big impacts on the rest of the supply chain. In third-party, we operate under external attestation. So often when we do a pen test, for example, we go to a third party and ask them to pen test us. Why? Because we don't want to be biased about what we're testing or what we're not testing. And so a third party is considered impartial. We have definitely an incomplete awareness of what's running on our third-party stacks and their infrastructure. And trust, of course, is exhibited through impartiality, meaning we have assessors and auditors that perform third-party assessments for us all the time. This is, of course, the sweet spot of what we call vendor risk management, VRM, or third-party risk analysis. And of course, your third parties have providers as well. And that's what we call fourth party or nth party risk. In this case, you have peer attestation that's going on, things like crowdsource, and Yelp reviews and other types of information, Better Business Bureau, that help us understand the reputations of these fourth parties. You have very minimal awareness of what that application stack is, and trust is essentially exhibited through proxy. You're trusting that fourth party or nth party because the third party selected them, the one that you're using and having a contract with. And then lastly, this is what I call ecosystem risk management, where you have the entire universe of supply chain, not just 1 degree upstream provider and 1 degree downstream consumer. A supply chain is not made up of 3 nodes. It's made up of the entire chain. And so we need to think about the health of the entire ecosystem of supply chain risk and not just 1 or 2 nodes on that link. Some of those dimensions that I mentioned, attestation, awareness, and trust. If Colonial Pipeline, for example, had performed a self-assessment back in 2020, what might have changed with that breach? I would say probably nothing. We need tools that can validate these assertions of compliance. Colonial Pipeline would have said, yeah, we have all of the controls in place that we believe we need to have in place. But it turns out, of course, they didn't because they were compromised, and it caused a really big impact to the entire Eastern Seaboard and the energy sector for several weeks. And people lost their lives because of some of the impacts and fear that was caused for hoarding of fuel and driving around with a swimming pool in the back of your truck full of gas. What else? Awareness. Who can afford to scan and monitor all of your vendor APIs, all of their websites, all of their SSL certificates, and all of their services? No one can. And that's why it's useful to have a company like SecurityScorecard that can scan all of the internet for you and sort of outsource that awareness aspect. And then trust. If zero trust architecture means always never trust, always verify, then for what values of always are practical? Do we simply insert 3-factor authentication, 4-factor authentication ad infinitum? It feels like inflation, right? Like those razor blade commercials where they have 5-blade razors now. That's really not the way to get a handle on trust. We need better tools for this. And then lastly, management, of course. When the Ever Given, that 2,000 TEU supertanker, launched itself sideways in the Suez Canal in March for 6 days, how many markets were affected? Supply chain, like I said, is not just about first-degree neighbors in the upstream and downstream relationships of goods and services. It needs to be about the entire ecosystem. So how do we make things more resilient and fault tolerant for the entire ecosystem? Well, we need to think about some of the risks that we're stuck with. And I wanted to focus on cognitive risk. So what are the things that we're stuck with today? Some of the risks that we don't really try to address because they feel too deep-seated, or they feel insurmountable, or maybe they just feel improbable. And so I think perhaps the biggest risk right now is a lack of cyber risk understanding at the executive level. The Space Shuttle Challenger, for example, the disaster in 1986, that was a result of cognitive risk. There was a culture of launch is a go. And that managed to keep engineers who knew that the O-rings were subject to cold temperatures overnight, the previous night, from stopping the launch. And management failed, not for a lack of knowledge or technique or control of the systems engineering, but they failed for a belief. And some engineers, Bob Ebeling, for example, was one of the 5 booster rocket engineers. And he tried to bring this fact up to light prior to launch. But the cognitive risk was prevalent, and they did not stop it. So let's dive into some different types of cognitive risk. And in this case, I've got a few examples to share: confirmation bias in data, prevention bias in budgets, too big to fail, and tired old concepts. So let's take a look at some of these. So confirmation bias is a phenomenon where analysts basically seek out and assign more weight to evidence that confirms their hypothesis, and they ignore evidence that could refute it. Analysts, of course, display this when they gather or they remember information selectively, or when they interpret it in a biased way. And they also tend to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting their existing position. This results in statistical errors that can turn into flawed intelligence. And of course, it's not just analysts that exhibit this behavior. The definition of a term and the creation of a board subcommittee or the omission of a word from a document, these can also convey confirmation bias. The May 12th executive order on cybersecurity, I might point out, does not contain the word resilience in its 8,000 plus words. And so the locus of debate is defined by our choice of words and our selection of data sets and our understanding of risk. Prevention bias. So this is a tendency in cybersecurity to focus on preventative measures at the expense of detection and response. Due in part to beliefs and feelings rather than facts. It could just be that we've all internalized the meme that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But a recent review of IT and OT standards, regulations, and best practices by Dragos.com clearly demonstrates that we have managed to codify prevention bias. They calculated that 75% of controls across various frameworks are focused on prevention, leaving only 25% for detection, response, and recovery. And now Benjamin Franklin coined this timeless phrase in 1736 in order to remind the citizens of Philadelphia to remain vigilant about fire awareness and prevention. But I don't think it was meant to keep them from knowing how to detect a fire and how to quickly put it out. Too big to fail. In this case, the cognitive risk is related to a theory in banking that asserts that certain corporations are so large that their failure would be disastrous to the greater economic system, and that they therefore need to be supported by governments when they face potential failure with bailouts. Even the mighty and super scaled Amazon Web Services have demonstrated that they too are not too big to fail. A November 2020 outage, for example, and you can choose from several, was eventually attributed to a fleet of front-end servers all reaching their default max threads limit for Linux. A good number of companies realized just what the phrase concentration risk means when thinking about how dependent so many businesses were on the US East region when it went down, or at least when a lot of the infrastructure in US East went down. So shown here are Randolph and Mortimer Duke, the main antagonist characters from the 1983 film Trading Places, which are stereotypes, of course, of white male boards of directors and some of the cognitive risk that might be engendered in the institutions themselves these days. And then tired old concepts was one other piece I wanted to share. These are terms that are normalized on the technical level, but they're oppressive on a societal level, such as whitelist, blacklist, master and slave, man in the middle. Why are all attackers men, right? Women can be attackers as well. So these are seemingly entrenched technical terminology, but it's relatively recent, and they can be replaced with alternative metaphors that are more accurate, that are clearer, that are less distracting, and that do not offend their readers or imply power relationships that reinforce stereotypes and cultural limitations. So shown here is a reminder that blue for boys and pink for girls was not always the gender norm. Michael wore pink and Wendy wore blue when J.M. Barrie wrote Peter Pan. So we should be using these other terms instead. Allow list, block list, primary replica, and on-path attack. And so these are just helpful ways for us to get around some of the cognitive risks that have emerged in the technology sector. Next up, I wanted to talk a little bit about systemic risk. Systemic risk is an emergent property of complex systems. The systemic risk, it actually emerges from no one specific component of a system, but rather as an unpredictable aggregate risk factor that's fluid and evolving. So how can we address the uncertainty of increasingly complex systems which we do not fully understand? Shown here is a satellite image from a 2003 Northeastern power blackout. The blackout's proximate cause was a software bug in the alarm system at the control room of First Energy in Akron, Ohio. It rendered the operators unaware of the need to redistribute load after some transmission lines drooped into foliage and caught fire. What would have been a manageable local blackout cascaded into the collapse of much of the Northeastern regional electricity distribution system. Let's see. Oh, this is my favorite quote. I love to mention Heraclitus, this ancient Greek philosopher and historian. He once said something along the lines of, you can never step into the same river twice. And this is not AI or machine learning hype, right? This is like OG InfoSec. And the river analogy, I think, works really well for InfoSec. Some folks, they want to sit in an inner tube with a six-pack of beer and float lazily along a windy oxbow of the river of digital transformation. Others, of course, strap on a helmet and head straight for the Class 5 rapids in order to get to the next stretch of their digital journey. So what are we actually doing when we're engineering systems in 2001? Are we actually building them and engineering and designing them, or are they actually assembled without an intelligent design, inspired by fashion and technology hype cycles, solutions looking for problems, essentially? I think that security chaos engineering is a healthy and emerging process and approach to thinking about ever-increasing complexity and thoughtful experimentation. And I think that's the key to finding new ways forward. We need to be able to embrace failure and not fear it. And so if you've heard of the Chaos Monkey or the Simian Army that Netflix had, this is the same thinking and is evolving from that. Systems engineering in 2021 is messy. It's like spumoni ice cream, mashed together bits of pistachio, vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. And these systems are less engineered these days than kind of assembled quasi-organically by gluing together various components that we want to have involved in the platform. Shown here is a dependency chart, the runtime graph for Mozilla Firefox as an example of that. Next up, what creates this complexity that engenders systemic risk? There's 4 parameters: numerosity, non-linearity, connectivity, and adaptation. And so let's see, fulcrums sometimes exist in complex systems, which can pivot the system based on elements which occupy a critical path in some flows, whether that's data, power, communication, or influence, and something that might be referred to as action at a distance. Shown here is an artist's visualization of quantum entanglement, perhaps the best modern example of a complex system of interaction, once described by Albert Einstein as spooky action at a distance. All right, so numerosity. Numerosity is many parts and elements. And it's not just a jar of marbles, right? They need to be multiple types of elements with relations and connections. And here I talk about having a system that is a part of an ecosystem, and an ecosystem is part of a biosphere. But what is the InfoSec equivalent of the biosphere? Shown here is a spiral honeycomb made by bees, 31 species of tetraconua bees in Oceania. These bees are often differentiated by the pattern of hive that they create, and researchers suggest that the details of individual worker bees might be genetically encoded to create the complex structure that each species is best at. In terms of nonlinearity, this is multi-level elementary interactions that create feedback loops and the possibility of what are called phase transitions, triggered by sensitivity to initial conditions. For example, like a coral reef collapse or a market crash. Shown here is a picture of the fire coral on the left and a bleached fire coral on the right. Australia's Great Barrier Reef has lost about half of its corals in the last few years. Chaos theory tells us that some elements express sensitivity to initial conditions, like salt values in crypto or sources of entropy in random number generation. And so I just point out that 1 + 1 in some cases is not equal to 2. 1 + 1 could be 0 in the case of canceling inverse sound waves, or 1 + 1 can be equal to 3 in the case of synergy, where the sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Next up, connectivity. Connectivity and the density of connections, where the emergent properties have more to do with the connections than with the properties of the elements themselves. So not all measures of connectivity depend on a pure density or strength of these connections. There's also an important network graph concept dealing with the strength of weak connections, which helps define your position in the non-Euclidean space of the internet. Shown here is a visualization of the email inboxes that were collected as part of the Enron investigation, along with the links between those people. And lastly, adaptation. Adaptation and degrees of autonomy of the member elements of a complex system. So it's if only simple rules and logic gates are in operation, then the system isn't going to be categorized as complex. And is it true, this is a question that I have yet to answer, is it true that high levels of diversity in a complex system, like tidal pools in the Sea of Cortez, do they equate to resilience and good health of a complex system? There are likely some complex systems that have low diversity, but I'll need to find some examples. Shown here is an excavation of a giant anthill where they filled all of the passageways with concrete. And this is a complex and adaptive system built naturally. And then lastly, on this topic, I wanted to point out sort of my big exemplar for 2021 of systemic risk, ERCOT, the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas. This was a potential black start event back in February when a cold storm, winter storm snap came into town, and all of Texas, was just a few minutes away from being back into the Stone Ages with the entire electrical grid powered down and offline. This was a potential what's called a black start event, something teams train for but have never actually experienced. And I don't make fun of Texas and this systemic risk of cascading failure and this massive drop in capacity and generation and imbalancing of the system. But the board did discuss the storm for only 40 seconds prior to the arrival in their meeting, and this could have been like months long of blackout. It wouldn't have just been rolling blackouts. It would have been the entire grid in all of Texas with no electricity for several months. And I said before, don't get me wrong here. This event is in all of our futures, given the current state of dependencies on critical infrastructure that's barely held together with duct tape and baling wire. I've built critical infrastructure, and I know that it is held together with duct tape and baling wire. So lastly, what do we do about all this risk? And so I want to talk about some solutions. This is the way. We need to mitigate cognitive risk by working to unbias ourselves. We need to address systemic risk by embracing failure and by running experiments. General techniques to unbias, create awareness, standardize decision processes, improve fact presentation, increase the accountability of people and involvement in decisions. For cognitive risk, against confirmation bias, well, we need to walk up to the data and ask it questions. You also need to be prepared to listen to the data and to hear what it wants to tell you. Combating prevention bias, it means allocating more time and budget for detection and response tools, and not just for detection and response tools, and not just prevention tools and controls. So identify your concentration risks by thinking about those too big to fail components on your platform, and introduce supply chain resilience by having multiple vendors that can provide the same service. And then lastly, for those old tired tropes, just drop them. Embrace new terminology in your documentation, in your word choice, and in your names for things. Let's see. The next piece I wanted to share is a little bit about a diagram that talks about pacing layers from Stuart Brand's book, The Clock of the Long Now, which was written in 1999. And in it, he observes that the pace is faster at the edge and slower at the center or the bottom of this diagram. And it's fairly easy to replace fashion in this diagram with the word technology, and throw in some forms, for technology like JavaScript, Python, OCaml, functional programming, things like that, or Perl over the last few years. And so the fashion is going to always be squiggly moving lines, but we really need to focus on what we're doing to improve the governance, and it's moving at a slower pace, a different cadence. And these things take time, of course, to influence and to improve. The other thing I wanted to mention is the executive order. I translated 2 sections of the executive order from May 12th from the White House. Section 2C is roughly translated: Section 1, log your shit. Section 2, make your shit searchable. Section 3, monitor your shit. And Section 4 of that section, share your shit in sticks and taxi format, which are standard formats for threat intelligence and event sharing. And then Section 2F of the executive order, roughly translated, means number 1, disclose when shit happens; 2, close copy CISA when shit happens; and 3, escalate serious shit as appropriate. And so the executive order essentially admonishes critical infrastructure to do the basic things that we all should have been doing all along. And of course, now we really mean it because there's an executive order. But don't get me wrong here as well. The OT and industrial control system folks, they've been asking for this kind of stuff for years. And I know firsthand, that this stuff is very fragile and critical, and can fall over. And so we have to be careful to understand that this executive order and this guidance on this governance level is meant to try to do the basics and to do them well, to patch your servers, to monitor them, to have log files. When people got hit with SolarWinds, some of the companies didn't even have log files to determine whether they were still compromised by the Russians with the back door that had been injected into it by APT29. Next, resilience, of course. This is a term that I said was missing in a lot of the government's guidance that's coming out. And I want to focus on what is resilience. Resilience is sometimes referred to as an object's ability to return to its normal shape after being subjected to force or extreme conditions. But this particular expression of the term, that actually originates in an engineering use of the word with things like tensile strength and ductile properties. But it was also introduced as a word, resilience, in ecology and psychology, where the concept is much less concerned with returning to a former state than it is with adapting and coping with extreme conditions and forces. And so in this case, I think there's 3 elements associated with resilience that we need to focus on: robustness, adaptability, and transformability. And of course, one can infer a degree of diversity as bringing with it some additional resilience as well. Think of the potato famine in Ireland, for example. And so do we want to have a digital potato famine, right, where some malware goes crazy, has a bug in it, and it bricks all of our OT devices and all of our iPhones and Android phones because someone didn't do proper QA on their malware? I think such an event may be coming. And then lastly, a sense of timescale has to be included. What is resilience within minutes might not appear to last, for decades, and vice versa. And if we don't agree on the timescale for defining what is resilience, then we might see the forest fires as catastrophes and not part of a larger cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Could the internet be made more resilient by a massive depopulation event like I was talking about with the digital equivalent of the potato famine? And then let's see, summary. How do we address that last quartile of risk? Because essentially that's what we're in the business of doing as security professionals. The first quartile, pretty easy to knock out. Second, third quartile, you know what it is. If you spend the money, you'll get it. But it's that fourth quartile, that last quartile of risk that is such a multidimensional problem. And it keeps morphing and changing, right? Like Heraclitus' river. It's a constantly changing threat landscape, and we have to be really on our toes. And so to address these and to mitigate some of these low probability but highly impactful events, such as remote monitoring tools, installing backdoors, remote monitoring tools like Kaseya, that are distributing ransomware. We need to teach ourselves how to ask the right questions and to question the boardroom asks. These are difficult. These are likely going to be difficult conversations and no easy answers, I'm afraid. But to not address them would likely obviate some of the potential paths to their resolution. So we need to ensure that risk is identified and discussed at the executive level, and that we understand cognitive bias and systemic risk, and that we talk about these things and we come up with ways to address it. And so I'd like to finish with a couple of clever quotes. This is from Greg Wood, the SVP of Technology and Risk Management at Walt Disney. When I was at Marvel, I worked closely with my peers, in the Disney sector. And he had this great quote that I got permission to use and repeat. As managers, we execute a plan. And as leaders, we manage scarcity. And as executives, we manage ambiguity. And in the background here, you can see Steamboat Willie, who's not Mickey Mouse. Steamboat Willie is set to enter the public domain in 2024. The difference between him and Mickey Mouse is that Mickey Mouse has white gloves and Steamboat Willie has black hands. But anyway, these are some of the things that we have to worry about in the future, ambiguity, scarcity, and a lack of planning. And then lastly, talking to the board and to executives is the easy part. Adding value to their thinking is what is, I believe, hard. And so what value can InfoSec add to the board's thinking about risk? Hopefully, it's much more than just make sure we don't get hacked. And so here's a QR code. If you're interested in a copy of my presentation, I'm happy to take questions now after finished. And I'll send you a copy of it because it's got some links and references to some of the things I talked about during the presentation. And with that, I wish you a good afternoon and look forward to answering your questions.
Okay, great stuff, Mike. I always love a good William Gibson reference, let alone a pair of them. And your translation of that recent executive order was priceless. But are you ready for some questions?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it was a little tongue-in-cheek, but at the end of the day, making those executive orders, more approachable, I think is a good, definitely a good task to set one's mind to.
Absolutely. So this was a great overview of big issues, and we have a lot of questions that have come in about some of those. But for anyone in our audience who isn't already familiar with SecurityScorecard, I just wonder if you can give us some background on what SecurityScorecard does and how it helps with some of these issues.
Sure. So like I mentioned at the beginning, SecurityScorecard's in the business of identifying risk and helping people mitigate risk. So we're a proactive solution. We're a sort of what's described as a left of boom technology. Boom is, of course, when the caca hits the fan. And so we scan all of IPv4 every day, and we find 30 to 40 billion vulnerabilities every week, and we map those to scorecards. So we currently have about 12 million scorecards, which is a letter grade A through F. And if you have an A, that means your security posture, from our scanning at least, is good. And we calibrate that grading and that algorithm of determining who gets a D and how many vulnerabilities we see every month. And so we're constantly tuning and refining it based on breach events and based on associated findings and vulnerabilities that are exposed. And so this is a zero-touch, no agent installed. You just log into the platform, which you can access for free, sign in, and look at your own scorecard. And we show you all of the details that we can see about you. And there's a real good discovery function here. You find things that are lost or forgotten, or perhaps rogue infrastructure that was provisioned with a credit card, by a marketing person, on Amazon, that you didn't even know was a part of your attack surface. And so we also operate a top 5 sinkhole on the gathering signals intelligence from malware. And so we get about 700 million events of those coming in per day. And so if we see active indicators of compromise coming from your network IP address ranges, we map that in as a pretty serious finding. And so a company that has a D or an F is going to be 7.7 times more likely to be breached than a company that maintains an AA score. And we help people figure out how to get to an A. We explain exactly how to remediate some of the findings. One of the most common ones, for example, is just the lack of HSTS headers, which is a way to pin all of your transactions to SSL or TLS, and to make sure that it's always encrypted. And you'd be surprised at the number of companies that don't think that that's a necessary mitigation that they have to apply. But a man-in-the-middle attack, or as I like to better call it these days, an on-path attack, is very easy to inject into an HTTP-only login flow. And so we just need to do the basics. And SecurityScorecard helps people do that.
Okay, great. Thanks for that explanation. So, first question here from comes from Gilbert, and he's asking, how can we overcome the quantifiability conundrum? So as an example of that, we place higher value on the things we can measure, regardless of how much actual risk they pose. Any thoughts on that?
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's definitely a bias that we need to pay attention to. The unquantifiable risk, is going to be sort of I don't know. You might think of it as like the boogeyman, right? In this case, we're thinking oftentimes about outliers actually on the risk pyramid. Think of like a zero day. A lot of times we pay more attention to a zero day vulnerability than we do to regular mundane vulnerabilities, and that's a shame because unless there's exploit code, that zero day is just a shiny thing. And yes, we do actually chase after shiny things sometimes in InfoSec. And that's a problem that we need to identify and try to get around. Quantifying cyber risk is itself difficult. And that's the whole reason Security Scorecard exists, is that we can make some sort of measure, an outside-in, objective, and impartial understanding of what is your attack surface and what are your vulnerabilities, all the things that the bad guys can see during a reconnaissance phase before trying to attack you, and help you mitigate that risk. And so, if we do pay attention to the things that are quantifiable, at least we can move on to worrying about the luxury of zero-day vulnerabilities that have no exploit code, because we've shored up the basics. We've done proper DNS. We have SPF records in our DNS to avoid business email compromise and spoofing. We've avoided putting remote desktop protocol, RDP port 3389, accidentally exposed to the internet without multi-factor auth. These are the kinds of things that lead to breaches, and we've seen them with SolarWinds or with Kaseya. We see their score declining over a period of months, and then there's a breach event. And so that's just a validation, I think, of our business model to share this information with people. And of course, you can learn about your third-party risk by looking at the scorecard of any of the ones that we've generated. And if that company that you want to know something about is not in our platform, it only takes about 15 minutes for us to build a provisional score. And so it's really helpful to understand, your attack surface, because the bad guys, they go after the weakest link. And you yourself may not be the weakest link, right? It's going to be one of your third parties, one of your suppliers.
Okay. Yeah, and on that question of the the ratings, there's a question from Bradford. Does Security Scorecard provide the security portion of a risk assessment, or is it a full-blown risk assessment?
Well, I would think that a good risk assessment is going to include a view of the inside out as well. Somebody that's going to ask you, what are your controls, for identity and access management? Do you have a password vault? Things like that. And we can't really discover this by just scanning, IPv4 space. We can see evidence that you have a WAF, a web application firewall, and we will give positive signals for that, as well as maybe a vulnerability to disclosure program. If you work with HackerOne, which is one of our partners. I just did a webinar recently with Alex Rice, their CTO and founder. And it's great to have them as a partner because we have a marketplace integration that shows whether there's a HackerOne vulnerability disclosure report for that third party. And anyone that has a VDP, right, a vulnerability disclosure program, is taking seriously, their security risk and their posture, and maybe even having a bug bounty program. And so the more that we are transparent about our approach, I think, the more, we can trust or distrust some of the vendor selections that we make.
Okay. Michael was picking up on the TOC references that you made, to things like man-in-the-middle attacks, and you suggested some workarounds for this, but he's asking, what's the best way to counter TOC in the boardroom?
TOC?
Yeah, I think that was your reference for things like terms of concern. I think it was.
Tired old concepts.
Tired.
Right.
That was
old
it.
concepts.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, get yourself a copy editor and copywriter who can clean up your language and find those outdated references. GitHub has been doing it, right? They've changed the default from master slave to replica, and primary. And so I think that would oftentimes find root, at least at the executive or C-suite level, in talking about a diversity and inclusion initiative. And so if you don't have sort of a chief diversity officer that's trying to make sure that you have the best talent, and that you don't just have a board of directors full of white males, right, trying to preserve the profits like Randolph and Mortimer Duke, in Trading Places. That's definitely governance evolution, and that takes time. So you can't just attack it head on and say, oh yeah, we want to have 50% women on the board, and our executive diversity and inclusion report is showing that we only have 30% female, let alone people of color in positions of authority and management. And so I think that's the kind of thing that has to be done bit by bit. Unfortunately, you can't really smash the hierarchy and expect what remains to become automatically inclusive, diverse, and have proper equity and representation. So I would say that if you are going to have that conversation, go the angle of HR, talk about the ability to hire the best talent. If you have nothing but plain old vanilla leadership, as opposed to chocolate or strawberry or pistachio leadership, you actually have a competition deficit if you don't have a diverse management team. So I think that's one way to tackle it. Okay.
And I should mention Gilbert wrote in that he loved the Trading Places reference. So well done on the presentation there. The next one comes from Paul. Paul's saying this presentation covered a lot of important cognitive distortions and biases. Are there other concepts that should face close scrutiny due to risks in ethics, discrimination, etc.?
Oh yeah, there's plenty more that can be discussed. Think about algorithmic applications of AI. I don't really think AI exists, but machine learning, for example. When I was at Disney, I definitely advocated for the creation of an ethics committee that was the intersection of legal and the engineering team, talking about, is there ethical bias? Is there bias in these algorithms? Can you have what's called an ethics audit or an AI bias audit? And these things will come eventually, whether self-inflicted, self-applied, or regulatory. I know New York, for example, is working on legislation to make sure that if you're doing housing and human services, and someone's bringing in a machine learning algorithm to figure out where to send caseworkers because of domestic disturbances that are called in, there's a huge bias built into those algorithms. Why? Because the training data is biased. And even just applying for a credit card, I don't know if people remember the furor that went up around Goldman Sachs's credit card with Apple, and that two people would apply for the same credit card, a husband and a wife. The husband would be approved, the wife would be denied. And yet they're both high income earners. They're both, contained advanced education, advanced degrees, secondary education. And it's because the actuarial tables on banking go back many, many years, right? Back to the beginning of finance. And women weren't allowed in many countries to actually have a bank account in their own name until like the 60s and 70s. And so there's just a bias in the data. And so we have to do some resets, and we have to tackle, some of these other ethical issues around technology in terms of bias and self-fulfilling prophecies saying, all these kinds of people are criminals. All these kinds of people are bad security risk. Don't give them a job. Don't give them a line of credit or a bank account. And so I think that's part of the NYU has something called Alliance for Public Interest Technology that I've been involved with. I'm a adjunct professor at NYU teaching cybersecurity, and I've gotten involved in some of these alliances as well to try to figure out how do we come up with ethical algorithms and not just go with algorithms that are generating more ad revenue for Facebook and Google, right?
Yeah, really interesting stuff. This next question comes from Shelby. With the way IT and security has evolved over the years, where do you see the SMB and education markets over the next few years in regards to risk?
Oh, the education space is all risk and no joy. I ran the security scorecard for NYU, and NYU's rival is Columbia. And so as long as NYU is better than Columbia, we're good. But they both have like low scores. Why? Because lots of professors think that they're system administrators, and the universities typically have really large digital footprints, meaning they have lots of IP space. And someone will just stand up a MySQL database and make it open to the internet, and Intellectual property theft is a big risk for a lot of these universities, including NYU. And these professors, just think, oh, share and share and like. Information wants to be free. A lot of them are maybe tree-hugging hippies from this, California, that want to, have and that's true in some regards. I love the fact that you can have open data and you can share information and you can grow, and learn and have the wisdom of the crowds. But in many cases, the security postures are horrible, and they only have like 3 people to manage the security for the entire university. And you're talking billions of dollars of endowment at risk and PII. And so I think that these kinds of tools, nonprofits, SMB and education, and of course medical. Medical can't even upgrade, some of their appliances off of Windows XP because the vendor doesn't support it. They haven't tested it on Windows 7 or Windows 10. And so you have all risk and no joy, as I call it. But I do like to try to help and to give. I include some security scorecard, lectures in my discussions about information security management, and help people understand how to quantify the risk, and use the best open source tools you can. Find partnerships, between academia and the public sector and private sector, and just help raise the water. Right, all boats rise, with the rising tide. If we get more people involved in InfoSec, and from more diverse backgrounds. And that's why I teach, essentially, not because I get well paid to teach, but because I want to give back and to bring more people into the space. Because I think we're about 2 million shy of a full team globally on the InfoSec world. And so there's plenty of room for many people to transition into this space and to learn how to, use technology, to make our identities and our economy and our society, more resilient to the attacks that are being levied against it.
Really interesting answers on the education side. Another part of that question was SMB. Is there an SMB play for Security Scorecard? Do small businesses benefit from using the technology?
Oh, definitely, because they have
yeah.
to pay $0 in order to see their risk. All they have to do is have a domain name, log in with that domain name, sign up for your instant scorecard, instant.securityscorecard.com, and you get to see everything we know about you. We want to share this information. We believe, of course, you'll eventually want to buy a subscription to have slots that are continuously monitoring those of your vendors and your core data tier 1 kind of providers, so that you have your finger on the pulse of their attack posture and surface as well. But it's free for everyone. And so if we had, 500,000 customers using freemium, that would not be a bad thing. We want our people to consume this product. That's why we don't charge for your own scorecard.
Yeah, and I think you've hit on the next. I had 2 more questions here from the audience about Security Scorecard specifically. One was, if the information is free, how do they make money? I think you've just covered that. But do you want to say anything else about it, as far as the value of freemium versus some of the value you get once you start paying for the product?
Well, yeah, let's say that you're a company, like Intel or something, and you want to have a vendor portfolio of like 40,000 vendors. That's where we get a larger subscription, right, an annual fee from those customers. But you can also, some of the ISACs, the information sharing and analysis communities, IT ISAC, for example, I sit in on those meetings every week, and we're a member there. And we give a self plus 5 free subscription to ISAC members to help them, because they're doing the good work as well, meaning they're doing threat intelligence sharing. And we have a really powerful threat intelligence team that we grew out of some of the folks that were leaving places like McAfee, on its way to the floor, unfortunately, as a security company. Now I think McAfee was merged with FireEye, was it? And so you could call it McAfee-eye. But anyway, Mandiant and FireEye kind of split because they had an original shotgun kind of wedding that didn't really work out so well. And so now they're going back into product versus incident response and services. And so I think that the ability to have access to this information and to get threat intelligence, the way I look at it, our ratings platform is just basically scanning all of the internet and consuming all of the vulnerabilities that are publicly available and presenting them back to the best of our knowledge as to who owns that piece of risk, that particular finding. And that's not easy to do, because the internet, like Heraclitus's river, is a fast-moving place. The risk of one IP address today could be different tomorrow, especially in the cloud service providers, right? There's about 70 million IP addresses that are in the cloud service provider network ranges, and we scan those 12 times a day. because those are really swiftly moving areas of water or areas of the internet. Yeah, it's important to understand how we can tackle this problem, how we can share this information. And our threat intelligence team then says, okay, of all of the risks that we've identified, we can tell you which ones are actively being targeted by an APT in your industry or against you as an individual company. And so we're moving into the area of professional services now to say, okay, this is my risk, so what? What do I fix next? Or what's actively being probed and prodded by the bad guys? And that's where threat intelligence comes in. And so that's a nice combination, additional offering that we have now.
Great. Hey, in the other security scorecard specific question that came in that I was hoping to get to was, am I able to permit security scorecard through my firewall for additional findings and results? Are there benefits to giving security scorecard any kind of permissions, or is it really the tool is designed for what people can see from outside, and then you use something else for internal assessments like that?
Yeah, for the longest time, we really didn't want to get the inside out perspective because it can be really messy. There's already people in that space, right? Qualys, Rapid7, Tenable, and we have them as marketplace integrations. But we are working on what you would call a 360-degree view. So we do want to help people understand their inside out risk as well, because we're really good at scanning and kind of coming up with an algorithm to judge the risk of certain CVEs, common vulnerability enumerations and exposures. And so it's important for us to grow that 360 perspective carefully, because we don't want to encroach on our marketplace partners, business. But we will be having things in the near future that help round out. And I like to think of it as in terms of necessary and sufficient. It's absolutely necessary to have an outside-in, perspective like this. And again, it's so easy to deploy because there's nothing to deploy. We're scanning the internet everywhere anyway every day, so you don't have to install an agent or an appliance or anything. But we do want to take that telemetry that is available from those existing solutions that are doing authenticated scanning on the inside of your network. But at the moment, there's no solution for that other than to mirror our scores into your asset management system and talk about the public assets and the vulnerabilities that we can see, and then you look at the inside assets. But I suspect within the next 6 months or so, we'll have some new product offerings that help make that even easier and take it to a new level, augmenting what you can learn, not just from a Tenable or a Qualys or a Nessus or a Rapid7, but from these other tools like security awareness and multi-factor authentication. If somebody failed a phishing test, Cofense or KnowBe4, if somebody failed a phishing test that month, that's an extra risk indicator, right? And that's the human element. We're dealing right now with just the assets that are on the internet, right? The devices. But I can definitely see the value in having a more holistic approach and getting that 360-degree view that includes inside out as well.
Well, it looks like we're running out of time, but Mike, if somebody wants to get started with Security Scorecard or find out more, any closing thoughts there?
Sure. Just browse to securityscorecard.com or go straight to instant.securityscorecard.com. Sign up for your free scorecard, and you get to see all of the details there. And then someone will, of course, want to reach out to you and say, are you liking what you see? Do you want to understand more? We also do security assessments and frameworks when we help people do the due diligence questionnaires. That's a product called Atlas that we're folding into the ratings platform that allows you to do event-based assessments. So rather than sending out a questionnaire once a year to your vendors, you can have an event like a breach, and it shows up on the scorecard, and it automatically sends a questionnaire to them. So that way you can scale to, like I said, 20, 40,000 vendors for some of our customers and not have a 300-person vendor risk management team. So that's definitely the best place to get started is instant.securityscorecard.com, or email me and I'll help you get set up. mwilkes@securityscorecard.com or .io. Sorry, we use .io for our email.
Gotcha. All right. Well, Mike, thanks very much. Really appreciate you being on and in such a thought-provoking presentation and great discussion here in the Q&A. Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks a lot, Scott. I was happy to do it.
And before we wrap up, we do have one more piece of business. It's the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of that gift card is Tom Manzi from Massachusetts. So congratulations to Tom. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Mike again for putting together this presentation, and I'd also like to thank SecurityScorecard for making this event possible. And last but not least, I'd like to thank all of you for attending and for your questions. That concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day.